Hello, you are listening to the COVID Inquiry podcast by PA Duffy and Co Solicitors, supported by Broudie Jackson Canter Solicitors. Hosted by Enda McGarrity from PA Duffy and Co Solicitors and Claire McNeilly, Senior Associate from Lanyon Group. The COVID Inquiry podcast will provide commentary, expert insight and opinion on the Module 2C public hearings, which are investigating core decision-making and political governance in Northern Ireland during the pandemic. Each week, Enda and Claire will be joined by guests to discuss evidence from the inquiry. Their interviews will bring listeners up to date with the implications from the Module 2C evidential hearings in a comprehensive and, most importantly, accessible manner. This week, Enda and Claire are joined by Catriona Myles, a member of the Northern Ireland COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice group, Nuala Toman from Disability Action Northern Ireland, and Conal McGarrity, Director of PA Duffy and Co Solicitors. Together, our guests will reflect on how the recent hearings went and look forward to the next few days of evidence. Please note, some listeners may find the contents of this podcast distressing.
Welcome to the second COVID Inquiry podcast by PA Duffy Solicitors with me, journalist Claire McNeilly, and my co-host Enda McGarrity, one of the lead solicitors representing the Northern Ireland Bereaved Families for Justice. On Tuesday, the inquiry began 3 weeks of hearings in Belfast. And all I can say is, where do we start? We've had a slew of revelations and subsequent news headlines, none of which paint Northern Ireland's political or health leaders in a great light when it comes to being prepared for the pandemic. On day one, we heard evidence from Marion Reynolds, a member of the Northern Ireland COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice campaign group, and also Nuala Toman from Disability Action Northern Ireland, who's here with us today on the podcast. On Wednesday, the inquiry heard from Eddie Lynch, the Commissioner for Older People, Jerry Murphy from the Northern Ireland Congress of Trade Unions, and Sir David Stirling, the former head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service. Also giving evidence were Chris Stewart from the Executive Office, Dr. Joanne McLean, the Director of Public Health at the Public Health Agency, and Jenny Piper, the former interim head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service. We're going to chat about some of the, at times, staggering disclosures, but first, I'm going to ask Enda for a general overview of everything we heard, and I'm sure we're all keen to hear your take on it all so far.
Thanks, Claire. Yes, it's been a pretty extraordinary start to Module 2C, and we're only a few days in. Already, some key themes are starting to emerge, including concerns around political dysfunction, a lack of preparedness for the pandemic, a delay in responding in early 2020, failures to safeguard the most vulnerable people in society, and issues around data loss and WhatsApp deletion. At the outset of the inquiry on Tuesday morning, we opened with an impact film, and Northern Ireland Bereaved Families for Justice members Fiona Humphreys, Jennifer Curry, Sean Scullion, Sharon Moore, Michael Lusty, Fiona Clark, Anita Milligan, Catherine Todd, and Lizzie Lyle all featured in the film and shared their experience of their tragic loss. I know that some members of Disability Action did as well. And I think it set the right tone at the beginning of this module. It was a reminder of the wide-ranging impact on virtually every section of society from the pandemic. We heard from Catherine Todd, who contracted COVID whilst pregnant and sadly lost her newborn son Ziggy, and what was described in the death certificate as maternal COVID. We also heard from Fiona Humphreys, who lost both of her parents 3 days apart. So the impact of the government's decision-making during the pandemic is something that two of our guests today, Catriona and Nuala, will be able to tell us about shortly. And I suppose it's probably a good opportunity now for Catriona and Nuala to introduce themselves.
Hi, so I'm Catriona Myles. I am a member of the Northern Ireland branch of the COVID Bereaved Families for Justice.
And I'm Nuala Toman, the Head of Innovation and Impact at Disability Action.
And also with us is Conal McGarrity, who has been in the hearings all week. He's another lead solicitor for Northern Ireland Broudie Families for Justice. And Conal, you wanted to discuss the opening statements then, that after the impact filming, the counsel to the inquiry gave her opening statement, followed by Peter Wilcock KC for the Northern Ireland Broudie Families and a number of other court participants. What were your thoughts on that?
Within Claire Dobbin KC's opening statement, she set out a very helpful chronology, and I thought that set a very useful framework for the rest of the evidence to be viewed within. So some of the events that Ms. Dobbin outlined were the following. On the 22nd of January, there was a pandemic flu subgroup within the Northern Ireland government, and they provided a paper about sector resilience in the context of pandemic flu preparation. And that paper noted that no work had commenced on sector resilience due to competing priorities and impact of staff due to EU exit preparations, and that Northern Ireland was more than 18 months behind the rest of the UK in terms of that objective. On the 24th of March 2020, Minister Swan attended the first COBRA meeting, although it wasn't until the 2nd of March that the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister started to attend at those meetings. The 25th of January, and I think this is a critical piece of evidence, in my opinion. There was an email from a Professor Woolhouse in Scotland. He emailed various people in Westminster to say that, having looked at some of the figures that were now becoming available, that if they were put into a model for Scotland and many other countries, they would likely predict that in over about a year, at least half of the population would become infected. The gross mortality rate would triple more at the epidemic peak, and that the health system would become completely overwhelmed. And that information was passed to the Northern Ireland Chief Medical Officer. So that was a very, very early warning sign. Moving on the 29th, there was a further COBRA meeting, and again, Minister Swan attended at that. There was officials from the Executive Office who also attended, and there was a Miss Rooney. She had sent an email and noted that COVID would become a global pandemic over the next 3 weeks, and she sent an email to Mr. Stewart, who was an official within the Executive Office, with particular responsibility for civil contingencies. And that was a stark assessment at that time about the risks and the impending pandemic. And at that stage, they thought fit to brief the First and Deputy First Minister. That was the 30th of January. After that, Miss Rooney noted in her statement that she received a call from the CMO expressing his satisfaction that she had prepared and submitted this submission and had not sent that or passed that through him. On the 30th and 31st of January, there's another important email exchange between the Northern Ireland government, and there was reference to the fact that the virus had caused significant numbers to become ill and die, with associated disruption across sectors, that it would be a pan-flu type incident in which cross-government coordination would be required. And that issue of cross-government coordination became very important because there was some ambiguity as to who had responsibility at different phases between the Department of Health and the Executive Office. Moving on the 6th of February, there was an important communication from the Director of Population Health in the Department of Health in Northern Ireland, and he stated, "I do not consider it necessary to activate NICMA arrangements at this time unless or until the infection appears and impacts are experienced here." That became an important issue, and Lady Hallett intervened, and she challenged the evidence of David Stirling, I think it was, that would be a little late to stand up those procedures after the pandemic had hit these islands. The 25th of February, there was a paper sent to the Executive Office board by Mr. Stewart, saying civil contingency arrangements in Northern Ireland have not been reviewed in over 20 years. The 12th of February to the 23rd of March 2020, the Chief Scientific Advisor was not at work due to illness. So that had important implications, and I think that will be borne out in the evidence as we move on. Northern Ireland had no modelling capacity. Meeting, this was an important date, the 2nd of March. We understand that was the first substantive discussion that took place at the executive committee, which I find remarkable given the interventions that had happened prior to that. 3rd of March, there was a question arising there as to whether there was a significant underestimation of the speed and the scale of what was unfolding, and that was reflected in some key communications. The 6th of March, and this is something that came out in evidence today and yesterday, the Cabinet Office sent an email to recipients across the UK seeking information about the impact of non-pharmaceutical interventions, and it sought a response by the 7th of March. We heard evidence that Ms. Rooney made inquiries as to who was going to respond, but ultimately the Chief Medical Officer intervened, and a response wasn't provided in time as sought. There was a briefing paper prepared on the 10th of March, and this relates to the approach that was being taken to large events in Northern Ireland. And it appears from this note that no government advice was provided to cancel large events, but rather organisers, for example, on St. Patrick's Day and football matches, they were asked to take decisions to cancel the events themselves, but there was no government mandated advice or decision in that regard. On the 11th of March, the Republic of Ireland announced a package of measures, and this included the closure of schools. 12th of March, this prompted a meeting between the head of the civil service, David Stirling, the First Minister, and the Deputy First Minister. There's a note of that meeting, and Sir David Stirling clarified there was no medical or scientific evidence to support the measures announced by the Taoiseach. The 12th of March, and again, it's understood because of a lack of testing capability, it wasn't clear there was testing taking place on any great scale in Northern Ireland. Thereafter, on the 18th of March, the executive only then activate the Northern Ireland hub, and as I've said, that seems remarkable given that the threat had been clearly outlined, a long time before that and in very stark terms. And then on the 19th of March, the first person in Northern Ireland to die from COVID died on that date. And then according to Sir David Stirling's evidence, on the 18th of March, they moved into a response stage. So I thought that was a very helpful chronology, and that provides a good framework really for viewing evidence.
Yeah, and that brings us almost nearly to the point of the 23rd of March, which it'll be etched in everyone's mind, because that was the day we locked down in Northern Ireland. And I think the commonly held opinion of many of the general public from 2020 until now is that the decision makers were doing the best they could with the information they had at the time. And given what has been outlined in the opening statements and what you've just discussed, Conal, I think some of those myths have been dispelled.
Yeah, I think that's a common misconception. And I think as more and more evidence comes out in the inquiry, it's clear that there was the information there. And in my opinion, certainly there was an imperative for government to respond more quickly and to certainly set up civil contingency procedures much more quickly.
Those stats and pieces of information, you've painted a very bleak picture of inefficiency. which of course would affect everyone in Northern Ireland, some more than others, and not least the bereaved families for justice. And I think it's a good time to bring in Catriona, because we heard from Marion Reynolds. She gave evidence, which was of course a very significant moment for the group. And Catriona, you yourself gave evidence in London during Module 2. So could you give us an insight into what it's like to have to do that, and maybe share how you felt watching Marion?
I said at the time when it was my turn that it was a very sad privilege to be in that position. Sad, of course, because I was there because my daddy's not here. And for Marion, she was speaking on behalf of her aunt, who's no longer with us. But a privilege because in Northern Ireland, within our campaign, we have 150 odd families, and at present Marion was the third family member to be able to recount her story. So that's one of the key messages that we're keen to drive home, is that we need to hear from more family members. There are broader issues at play here, and we keep banging the drum that we won't be silenced, but the inquiries seem to try very hard to sort of keep us under lock and key in a box. It's paramount that it's not a box tick exercise for us, that we're not being played like puppets, because you have to remember that every time we put ourselves out there, we have to go back to the darkest days of our lives, and then we have to piece our lives back together after we've told our stories. So Marion was remarkable. I mean, we knew she was going to be. But, by saying that, you can't take away from how nervous you inevitably will be before you do it. It's not somewhere you're used to being, and although we're not the ones on trial, it still sort of feels a bit like that. But she was so composed and so measured, so articulate, so concise, but you could still feel the love she had for her aunt and the sense of responsibility she had. And I thought one of the key things that came across, that notwithstanding Marion's career in social care, it didn't make a jot of difference to her being able to access what she needed for her aunt. She couldn't get to be a care partner that was in the guidance. She wasn't allowed to feed her aunt in hospital, all those things that, it's maybe understandable for the likes of myself, who hasn't got a background like that. But it didn't matter for Marion knew what should be happening, but it wasn't happening. And regardless of whose door she knocked on and how many times she contacted Eddie Lynch, for example, it didn't make a jot of difference. The computer just said no. But in terms of evidence, yeah, she was fantastic. We had no doubt. We knew we were in good hands with Marion.
We'll have maybe I could ask Nuala, who also gave evidence, and I was listening to it, and some of it should have made for very unpleasant listening for the people who perhaps arguably could have done more. You talked about the tokenistic engagement with disabled people, Nuala, and you said many felt invisible, isolated, unheard and uncared for. Did you get the feeling that you were really being listened to when you gave your evidence?
The whole experience of giving evidence is really, as Catriona has highlighted there, it's quite an odd experience, because the way in which the evidence is approached, they question you very, very diligently. And it was done really, really seriously. And I did almost at times feel like I was under an interrogation. And I suppose, reflecting back on it, I could really see that I was also taken on a journey that allowed me to kind of articulate the experience of disabled people in the context of whether or not it was listened to. I think it's interesting in this particular module that from the outset, the KSE for the COVID inquiry introduced key themes that that had been raised by the bereaved families, you know, very early on in the opening of the inquiry, and also disabled people, and actually pointed towards some lessons that could be learned. And I think that indicated that there is a positive opportunity for lessons to be learned from the inquiry. I suppose the most challenging aspect of it is just listening to just listening to Catriona, you know, arriving at the inquiry and seeing all of those people who had all lost family members all together, and actually feeling that collective grief that they'd experienced was really, you know, overwhelming. And it kind of points towards the importance of this inquiry, you know, conducting its duties extremely thoroughly and ensuring that the evidence-based approaches that is being taken actually identifies recommendations that will be implemented to protect people in the future. I mean, the stories that we heard in the opening video were horrendous. You know, were absolutely horrendous to hear people bare their souls like that, and to know that every single person that had participated in that opening video had done that and shared those stories with someone that they probably only met that day. And that, to me, you know, I just found it, you know, and Catriona says that there, you know, it is a privilege to hear that information, but you also kind of accept it with this responsibility that we really need to do more as a society to ensure that people are better protected. And from the disabled person's perspective, you know, what we do know is that people were left hungry, alone, isolated. The lack of PPE really placed disabled people's lives at risk. The collapse of health and social care really left disabled people stranded without food. The pipelines that were put in place were not effective in terms of reaching disabled people. The overall political dysfunction and the lack of cross-departmental working just meant that people who had information and insights in order to how to protect people weren't listened to. And if we reflect back to how we all felt at the beginning of the pandemic, you know, these issues were in the news from December. You know, we were hearing about this from December, and it really is stark when you listen to the amount of delay there was in terms of actually even establishing a response, and the sheer number of missed opportunities and the lack of attention to statutory obligations, the need to mitigate. It's shocking. And you know, as we'll talk on today, every single layer of witnesses, just as Conal was outlining earlier, just really illustrates how many errors were made in our society, and people like Catriona, people like the disabled people that we represent, are the people that have really lost because of the lack, you know, the lack of a strategic approach, and, you know, the absence of collective leadership to make a difference and to protect people. And to me, it's just shocking.
And I know we're only in week one, but do you get the sense that there's anger coming through from the people who were most affected?
You know, it's a really strange emotion that you're picking up on, because there's hopelessness, there's anger, there's fatigue, there's frustration, there's grief, there's loss, there's all of this process of re-traumatization that people are going through every time they have to tell their story. And I really think we all deserve better than what happened during the pandemic. And even it's so stark because our recent experience of the cost of living emergency really shows that nothing, you know, in terms of there may be a process through this inquiry to identify lesson learned. If we look at consider what has happened to disabled people through the cost of living emergency. You know, for example, we know that disabled people couldn't access the emergency payment that was given by the executive, you know, through the AFC, because disabled people remained hidden because they weren't showing up in the data that they had access to around, you know, means tested benefits, which meant effectively we're still being left out and forgotten and left behind, and there are still disabled people going hungry. And you know, it's just very, very depressing, you know, and all of us, I think, are just looking for something to change. And I have to say, like, sitting as a disabled person being represented in the inquiry, you know, is one thing, but my heart really, you know, goes out to all of the bereaved families, and really think that these are the people who should be listened to the most, because they've lost the most. And it's really important that the bereaved families are heard.
So obviously we heard from a lot of witnesses today: Eddie Lynch, Jerry Murphy, Sir David Sterling, Dr. Joanne McLean and Jenny Piper. And was there anything that stood out for you in particular?
Yes, there's been a lot packed into the past few days. The first witness on Wednesday was the Commissioner for Older People, Eddie Lynch. He was highly critical of the failure to protect the most vulnerable, something that was identified by Peter Wilcock in our opening statement, and with particular emphasis on care home residents. He described the decision to discharge untested hospital patients en masse into care homes as reckless. He spoke about the decision to suspend RQIA inspections, observing that the decision raises major concerns that there wasn't sufficient scrutiny and oversight over care homes during the period of this suspension. He also highlighted the difficulties with visitation in care homes and the failure to roll out the care partners scheme, which Marion Reynolds also touched on in her evidence. Catriona, you'll be well aware that a lot of the bereaved families have issues around care homes. What was your thoughts on the Commissioner's evidence?
I suppose I was coming at it from a bit of a biased view, because I've heard so many awful accounts of people approaching the Commissioner for assistance to try to get to be care partners, and for him to advocate for them throughout the pandemic, throughout lockdown particularly. And either he seemed to get nowhere for them, or he didn't try. I'm not quite sure, and I know it's not him that we're here to talk about as such. But yeah, I don't think anything really came out that our families didn't already know. Really, he said about how reckless it was about the testing. People have been sent to the care homes that hadn't been tested and stuff. My question really would be, and maybe didn't go far enough, or we don't have time, did he raise that concern? Did he say this shouldn't be happening, or this has to stop, or whatever, But as I say, I'm coming at it being very close to the likes of Martina and seeing it from her perspective, and knowing how hard she tried to work with Eddie Lynch to get those changes implemented early doors. We're talking sort of into sort of end of April, May time of 2020. And I know that, nothing had changed come the end of the second wave.
Yeah. Another key witness this week was Sir David Sterling. Is the former head of the civil service, and head of the civil service, importantly, at the time that the pandemic struck. Counsel to the inquiry, Claire Dobbins, Casey's questioning was largely focused on early 2020, and she provided a very helpful chronology, similar to what Conal has set out. I suppose some of the key questions that arises from that is number one, who was responsible for planning for and responding to a pandemic in Northern Ireland? Number two, what information was available to those key decision makers at the time? And number three, what action did they take or fail to take? And Conal, I've mentioned to you about this narrative that people have about, following the science and doing the best with the information they had at the time. How do you reflect on the Stirling evidence?
Well, for a start, there's no, and this remains the position today, there's no chief scientific advisor directly providing scientific advice to the executive office, who have overall responsibility for civil contingencies, and that's a very, very alarming position. The second issue is that there's a clear tension, and this came out in David Stirling's evidence about who had responsibility and at what stage for this pandemic. The position was that the Department of Health were the lead department, as it was categorised as a health only issue. As matters escalated, government's role should kick in when there's a strategic level intervention that needs to happen, that cuts across various departments. There didn't seem to be any clear certainty as to when that point was reached, and there's question marks about decision making and assessments on that. And going back to the chronology, the civil contingencies here was only stood up by the executive office on the 18th of March, and it's our clear assertion that was not in line with the warnings that were being fed into government, and that was too late. One of the matters we addressed in our opening statement was that these decisions had consequences, and you will see then shortly after that we have the first wave. So there is a causal link between that lost February, the delay thereafter, and real life consequences that our clients know all too well. The second wave then, in my view, is even worse than that, because the same decisions happened all over again, and there was a failure to learn lessons, and most of the deaths were concentrated within those two peaks. The first wave, there was an average of 25 deaths per day, and then in the second wave there was an average of 35 deaths per day. So I think decisions definitely fed into those statistics, and that's a matter of serious regret and concern.
Yeah, and then another theme that was explored in some detail with Sir David Stirling was this idea of political dysfunction, and he talked about a culture of leaking in the executive, describing it as endemic for many years, and in fact much worse in recent years. This leaking theme undermined trust and collaboration in the executive, but also had practical implications where key information was withheld prior to important meetings, which really had a knock-on effect on inefficient and ineffective decision making. So it's also this idea of the culture within government having practical implications for ordinary people. Baroness Hallett interestingly picked up on this, the leaking comments. She asked whether there had ever been any enforcement action taken against those responsible for the leaks, and Stirling confirmed that there hadn't. I think the idea was that it was so common and had been going on for so many years that it was difficult to identify who the perpetrators were. How concerning is that for you, Catriona, listening on to that?
I suppose from a lay person's perspective, it's nearly as if, are the politicians in Stormont saying the whole thing's broken, so what's the point in even trying to mend it? I was speaking to somebody yesterday, and I said this whole idea of dysfunctional governance, it's not carte blanche that the citizens of Northern Ireland just get any old treatment. You know what I mean? Like something, we've heard this term bandied about so much. When is something going to change, and when is somebody going to do something about it? And if this inquiry and the findings in this inquiry is not enough catalyst to change, well, I don't know what will be,
think someone looking on who isn't from Northern Ireland would find this all very strange, because we obviously have a very different political coalition here. There's a mandatory coalition of 5 parties who obviously often have diametrically opposed views. And Sterling also discussed the bargaining process that took place between the 2 main parties, in particular, the DUP and Sinn Féin. Essentially, he said that concessions on disputed issues wouldn't be made unless the other party was also willing to make a concession. And Peter Wilcock described this in his opening statement as lowest common denominator decision making. Nuala, had you any views on that?
So I think all of the evidence that has been presented around political dysfunction really shows how difficult it is to have effective plans and strategies put in place. And when high-level political issues are causing tension, it's disabled people, older people, and people who require most, assistance or targeted interventions that lose the most, because that's where we became invisible. And the emphasis, hearing words like lowest common denominator politics, hearing people present evidence of actions, the delay that is placed on actions because politicians can't agree, is really worrying. And in the context of the COVID inquiry, for everyday people, this was a matter between life and death. And we as citizens deserve better. And I was reflecting when I give evidence on the fact that we do have statutory duties, through Section 75, which say that, equality category should be built into policy and practice development from the start. So disabled people, older people, children should all be factored into policy development from the beginning. And if a decision is going to have a negative impact on any Section 75 category of person, then a mitigation should be put in place. And all of this time spent arguing, all of the division meant that there were no mitigations put in place at any point to address the worst impacts of the decisions that we saw, reflecting on, the older person commissioner's comments around, discharging people to care homes. That could have been avoided with an effective test and trace policy. Greater consideration of how to kind of safely manage patients, admissions and discharges could have seen a very different result. I mean, there was an example in the Camden area of London that was documented on the news at the time, where what they did was they established a completely separate health wing for older patients who had contracted COVID but did not require the degree to hospital admission that would have meant access to ICU. And those older people survived. Those older people survived because a bespoke mechanism was put in place to address their health needs at that particular time. And that was an example of a mitigation that worked. I would struggle to find an example of a mitigation that was implemented during COVID that worked for disabled people or older people or children. And this is where we really have to question the kind of political system that we have.
Yeah, and I know that impact equality assessments is something that you've been acutely aware of. Conal, have you any thoughts to follow up on that?
Yes, I done a case a number of years ago, which is the lead authority on the legal requirement to carry out impact assessments. It was a case of Thaddeus Stack, and what became clear in that case was that the courts in Northern Ireland adopted a different approach to those in England and Wales, where enforcement is automatic and they take a more robust approach. In that case, I think an impact assessment had not been properly carried out, but the court didn't hold that was an actionable breach. But more broadly, I was struck this week about the lack of legal protection that elderly and vulnerable people do, and how efforts from organisations like yourself haven't got very far. Under the new decade new approach deal, there was a commitment to implement age discrimination legislation for older people. That still has not happened, and that's a matter of concern. And there's a bill from 2018 which was to be brought in to protect and enshrine the rights of older and more vulnerable people, and that still has not come into law. And that really exposes a very serious issue with our system. Number one, in terms of the lack of legal protection and the lack of rights for older and more vulnerable people, but also getting things done and getting the business of government carried out.
Yeah, and I suppose a takeaway point is that far be it from throwing a protective ring around care homes, for example, decisions taken by government actively place them in a worse position, far from mitigating the harms that they may have faced otherwise. Moving on to today's evidence then, Nuala, your lawyers questioned Jenny Piper, the former interim head of the civil service. What were your thoughts on her evidence?
I think when Danny was questioning the former interim head of the civil service, Jenny Piper, it's quite clear that there were a number of documents that had been shared with the executive office that outlined serious findings in respect of the experiences of disabled people during COVID-19. And from the evidence presented, she had not accessed or engaged with any of them. And it was quite clear from that evidence that disabled people really weren't being considered in the context of the pandemic within the executive office. There was reference made to one reference to disabled people in the recovery plan, and that was around disabled people in work. That very much reflects kind of those broader conservative approaches around, getting disabled people back into work. And I think in the context of the pandemic and everything that we have looked at around access to food, access to medicine, decline in physical and mental health, looking at disabled people purely from an economic perspective further reflects the way in which we experienced the pandemic. And I think it was quite clear at times that decisions, from the perspective of the disabled person, that there were decisions being taken where the economy was at the front and centre, as opposed to protecting people. I'm thinking particularly around the transition into the second wave. It's heartbreaking and it's shocking to hear those things. Dr. Joanne McLean from the Public Health Agency also outlined that people know about health inequalities, and that's quite clear what the health inequalities in our society is. The issue is they weren't addressed in terms of the decision making at that time. And I really think it's important that lessons are learned from this inquiry. I mean, as just we're opening this podcast, when you listen to it, we're only really about 48 hours into this. And so much has been identified in terms of dysfunction, lack of detail, lack of consideration, poor decision making, that it really feels like it's going to be a very, very long 3 weeks.
So it has been a busy week of evidence and we've had a lot to take in, but I'd like to ask each of you for your highlight. What, for example, was the biggest takeaway or the moment that stood out? Catriona, would you like to share that with us?
Well, when I get to go first, I can't but mention Peter Wilcock and his mic drop moment, I suppose we would call it. speaking to the press afterwards and referring to the evidence that the chief medical officer had said that the politicians in Stormont were dysfunctional bees. I would never say that word, as you guys know. But what I really took out of that was that how many salacious headlines there have been running with that. And journalists seem to be missing the point. You know, what gets me is that someone in his position thought of the politicians in Stormont as being dysfunctional, but yet no, the headline is that the chief medical officer would say such a thing, you know. So, I mean, that has to be the standout really from the week. And anybody that knows Peter Wilcott, he doesn't say very much, but what he does has impact. So I think he's certainly done that this week. So that would be my highlight of the week.
Yeah, but what about all the WhatsApp messages that have mysteriously gone missing or been wiped?
Oh, yes.
It was interesting to know what was
I am getting back on the train tomorrow to go and hear a bit more about that, hopefully. Yeah. So,
Nuala, what stood out for you?
I was really taken with Marion's evidence, you know, about her aunt who was deaf. And I have to say, for me, listening to everything they experienced, the lack of regard, hearing Catriona talk about the ways in which, you know, contact was made with the Older Persons Commissioner to try and resolve all of this, you know, that people were working really hard to try and protect their families and reaching out to everyone to try and make a difference. And the fact that those people weren't listened to is heartbreaking. And when I was sitting in the inquiry room listening to how, you know, her aunt, you know, the food that was left lying around the room, the fact that a much loved woman was wearing somebody else's clothes, that her clothes were left in bags in a wardrobe, like the complete lack of humanity that was demonstrated towards Marion and her aunt. I mean, that just devastated me. And I think, you know, we might hear all of these references to political dysfunction and to things that happened in the executive and to mistakes that were made, but taking it back to the person really shows the devastating impact that all of this has had on people's lives. And people are living with this, you know, now. And that really, for me, like demonstrates why this inquiry is important.
I suppose it makes people ask questions as to were the right people in charge at the worst possible time for Northern Ireland. Conal, what about you?
Yes, Nuala and Catriona took both of the points that I wanted to cover. So I'll go on to a third point, and it was under the theme of the last month of February and the delayed response thereafter. I think that was a critical time, and there was a 2021 report from the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response, which was established by the World Health Organization, and that described February 2020 as a lost month when steps could and should have been taken to curtail the pandemic. They noted that their declaration of a public health emergency of international concern as early as the 30th of January 2020 was the loudest alarm the World Health Organization could sound, and should have put governments around the world on notice that such a forceful and immediate response was required, given the mounting evidence that a highly contagious new pathogen was spreading around the world. So I think that elucidates that point that we were on alert very early, and I think it calls into question then the response after that.
Enda, what stood out for you?
I'm going to take liberties and give you two. The first one was Sir David Stirling's evidence as a whole. You know, it was a really unique insight into the inner workings of government at a time of crisis. I think most people would have expected there to be internal issues, but I think many would be quite alarmed by the degree of chaos and dysfunction that there appeared to be. And I'm sure we'll hear more about that in the next couple of weeks. The The second one is just is Marion's evidence and the presence of the bereaved in support of her. There was an image of everyone together outside the inquiry, and it's just so powerful. You know, when everyone comes together, and obviously it's a significant moment because the inquiry has come to Belfast for the first and only time. The inquiry has come about as a result of the bereaved families campaigning, and I thought it was just a hugely significant moment.
So looking ahead, we have a very big week coming up next week. We're going to hear from Richard Pengelly, former Permanent Secretary for the Department of Health, and Professor Ian Young, the Chief Scientific Officer, on Tuesday. On Wednesday, we'll see Lord Peter Weir, the former Minister of Education, Conor Murphy, the former Finance Minister, Diane Dodds, the former Economy Minister, and Deirdre Horgy and Carl Nicolin, former Ministers for Communities. Thursday, we'll see Naomi Long, Minister for Justice, Edwin Poots, Minister for Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs, and Sir Brandon Lewis, the former Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. And up last, with a whole day of evidence ahead of him, is Professor Sir Michael McBride, Northern Ireland's Chief Medical Officer. It will definitely be a busy week. Thank you all for participating in the podcast, and we'll be back with more analysis and insight next week.
Thanks for listening to this instalment of the COVID Inquiry podcast. We hope you found it insightful and interesting. If you did, please rate us on the podcast platform you use and share it with friends and family who may value this type of commentary. We're looking forward to you joining us next week for more expert commentary, opinions, and insight into the COVID Inquiry evidential hearings.